The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 6, Side 1. To every argument, says Sextus, an equal argument can be opposed, so that in the end there is nothing so superfluous as reasoning. Deduction is untrustworthy unless based upon complete induction, but complete induction is impossible, for we can never tell when a negative instance will turn up. Cause is merely a regular antecedent, as Hume would repeat, and all knowledge is relative. Similarly, there is no objective good or evil. Morality changes across every frontier, and virtue has a different definition in every age. All the arguments of the 19th century against the possibility of knowing whether God exists or not are stated here, and all the contradictions between benevolent omnipotence and worldly suffering. But Sextus is a more complete agnostic than the agnostics, for he affirms that we cannot know that we cannot know. Agnosticism is a dogma. But, he consoles us, we do not need certainty. Probability is enough for all practical purposes, and the suspension of judgment, epoche, or holding back, aphasia, saying nothing, in philosophical questions, instead of disturbing the mind, brings it a careless peace, or ataraxia. Meanwhile, since nothing is certain, let us accept the conventions and beliefs of our time and place, and modestly worship our ancient gods. Lucian would have belonged to the skeptic school if he had been so unwise as to fetter his judgment with a label. Like Voltaire, whom he resembled in all but pity, he wrote philosophy so brilliantly that no one supposed that he was writing philosophy. As if to show the spread of Hellenism, he was born at Samosata, in distant Commagene. "I am a Syrian from the Euphrates," he said. His native tongue was Syriac, his blood probably Semitic. He was apprenticed to a sculptor, but deserted to a rhetor. After a stay in Antioch practicing law, he took to the road as a dependent scholar, living by lecturing, especially in Rome and Gaul. Then in AD 165 he settled down in Athens. In his later years he was rescued from poverty by the pious but tolerant Marcus Aurelius, who appointed the irreverent skeptic to an official post in Egypt. There, at a date unknown, he died. Time has preserved 76 of Lucian's little books, and many of them are as fresh and pertinent today as when he read them to friends and audiences 18 centuries ago. He tried his hand at a variety of forms until he found a congenial medium in the dialogue. His dialogues of the Hetairae were free enough to win a large audience, but at least in his works he is more absorbed in the gods than in courtesans. He is never through mishandling them. "When I was a boy," says his Menippus, "and heard the tales of Homer and Hesiod about the gods, adulterous gods, rapacious gods, violent, litigious, incestuous gods, I found it all quite proper, and indeed was intensely interested. When, however, I came to man's estate, I observed that the laws flatly contradicted the poets, forbidding adultery and rapacity." Perplexed, Menippus went to the philosophers for an explanation, but they were so busy refuting one another that they only confounded his confusion. So he made himself wings, flew up to heaven, and examined matters for himself. Zeus received him magnanimously and allowed him to watch Olympus functioning. Zeus himself was listening to prayers as they came up to him through a row of openings with lids like well covers. Of those at sea, one prayed for a north, another for a south wind. The farmer asked for rain, the fuller for sun. Zeus seemed puzzled. He did not know which prayer to grant, and experienced a truly academic suspension of judgment, showing a reserve and equilibrium worthy of Pyrrho himself. The great god rejects some petitions, grants others, and then arranges the day's weather: rain for Scythia, snow for Greece, a storm in the Adriatic, and about 1,000 bushels of hail for Cappadocia. Zeus is disturbed by the new and outlandish gods who have stolen into his pantheon. He issues a decree that, whereas Olympus is crowded with polyglot aliens, who have caused a great rise in the price of nectar, and the old and only true gods are being squeezed out, a committee of 7 shall be appointed to sit on claims. In Zeus Cross-Examined, an Epicurean philosopher asks Zeus, are the gods also subject to fate? "Yes," answers the genial Jove. "Why then should men sacrifice to you?" asks the philosopher, and "If fate rules men and gods, why should we be held responsible for our actions?" "I see," says Zeus, "that you have been with that accursed race, the Sophists." In Zeus Tragedus, the god is in a gloomy mood, for he observes a great crowd gathering in Athens to hear Damis the Epicurean deny, and Timocles the Stoic affirm the existence and solicitude of the gods. Timocles breaks down and runs away, and Zeus despairs about his own future. Hermes comforts him. There are plenty of believers left, a majority of Greeks, the body and dregs of the people, and the barbarians to a man. That such a peace should have brought no indictment on Lucian's head proves either the tolerance of the times or the twilight of the Greek gods. But Lucian was as skeptical of rhetoric and philosophy as of the old religion. In one of his Dialogues of the Dead, Charon commands a rhetorician, whom he is ferrying to the other world, to strip off that boundless length of sentences that is wrapped around you, and those antitheses and balanced clauses. Otherwise the boat will surely sink. In Hermotimus, a student enters with enthusiasm upon the study of philosophy, hoping that it will give him some substitute for faith, but he is shocked by the vanity and greed of the rival teachers, and is left intellectually and morally naked by their mutual refutations. Henceforth, he concludes, I shall turn aside from a philosopher as from a mad dog. Lucian himself defines philosophy as an attempt to get an elevation from which you may see in every direction. From such an elevation, life seems to him a ridiculous confusion, a chaotic chorus in which all the dancers move and shout, each at his own individual will, until the impresario dismisses them one by one from the stage. In Charon, he paints a dark picture of the human scene as witnessed by superhuman eyes from some celestial peak. Men plowing, toiling, disputing, suing in the courts, lending at usury, cheating and being cheated, running after gold or pleasure, over their heads a cloud of hopes, fears, follies, and hates. Over these, the fates spinning the web of life for each human atom. One man is lifted high from the mass and then has a resounding fall, and each in turn is drawn away by some messenger of death. Charon observes two armies fighting in the Peloponnesus. Fools, he comments, not to know that though each of them should win a whole Peloponnesus, he will get but a bare foot of ground in the end. Lucian is as impartial as nature. He satirizes the rich for their greed, the poor for their envy, the philosophers for their cobwebs, the gods for their non-existence. In the end, he concludes with Voltaire that one must cultivate his garden. Menippus, finding Tiresias in the lower world, asks him, "What is the best life?" The old prophet answers, "The life of the ordinary man is the best and most prudent choice. Cease from the folly of metaphysical speculation and inquiry into origins and ends. Count all this clever logic as idle talk, and pursue one end alone, how you may do what your hand finds to do, and go your way with never a passion and always a smile." If we sum up Greek thought in the first 2 centuries of our era, we find it, despite Lucian, overwhelmingly religious. Men had once lost faith in faith and taken to logic. Now they were losing faith in logic and were flocking back to faith. Greek philosophy had completed the circuit from primitive theology through the skepticism of the early sophists, the atheism of Democritus, the reconciliatory blandishments of Plato, the naturalism of Aristotle, and the pantheism of Stoa, back to a philosophy of mysticism, submission, and piety. The Academy had passed from the utilitarian myths of its founder through the skepticism of Carneades to the learned devotion of Plutarch. Soon it would culminate in the heavenly visions of Plotinus. The scientific achievements of Pythagoras were forgotten, but his notion of reincarnation was having another life. Neo-Pythagoreans were exploring the mysticism of number, were practicing a daily examination of conscience, and were praying that after a minimum of avatars they might pass, if necessary through purgatory, into a blessed union with God. Stoicism was ceasing to be the proud and scornful philosophy of aristocrats, and had found its final and most eloquent voice in a slave. Its doctrine of a final conflagration of the world, its rejection of all pleasures of the flesh, its humble surrender to the hidden will of God, were preparing for the theology and ethics of Christianity. The Oriental mood was capturing the European citadel. Chapter 24. The Hellenistic Revival. 1. Roman Egypt. Egypt should have been the happiest of lands, for not only was the earth freely nourished by the Nile, but the country was the most self-sufficient in the whole Mediterranean basin. Rich in cereals and fruits, cutting 3 crops a year, unexcelled in its industries, exporting to 100 nations, and seldom disturbed by foreign or civil war. And yet, perhaps for these reasons, the Egyptians, Josephus notes, appear never in all their history to have enjoyed one day of freedom. Their wealth tempted, their semi-tropical lassitude suffered, one despot or conqueror after another through 50 centuries. Rome classed Egypt not as a province but as the property of the emperor and ruled it through a prefect responsible only to him. Native Greek officials administered the 3 divisions, Lower, Middle, and Upper Egypt, and the 36 nomes or counties, and the official language remained Greek. No attempt was made to urbanize the population, for Egypt's imperial function was to be the granary of Rome. Large tracts of land were taken from the priests and turned over to Roman or Alexandrian capitalists to be worked as latifundia by fellaheen accustomed to merciless exploitation. The state capitalism of the Ptolemies was continued in reduced form. Every step in the agricultural process was planned and controlled by the state. Proliferating bureaucrats determined what crops should be sown and in what quantities, annually allotted the requisite seed, received the product into government warehouses, or thesauroi or treasuries, exported Rome's quota, took out taxes in kind, and sold the rest to the market. Corn and flax were state monopolies from seed to sale. So, at least in the Fayum, was the production of bricks, perfumes, and sesame oil. Private enterprise was permitted in other fields, but under ubiquitous regulation. All mineral resources were owned by the state, and the quarrying of marble and precious stones was a governmental privilege. Domestic industry, already old in Egypt, now expanded in the towns. Ptolemais, Memphis, Thebes, Oxyrhynchus, Sais, Bubastis, Naucratis, Heliopolis. In Alexandria, it was half the life of the vibrant capital. Apparently the paper industry had reached the capitalist stage, for Strabo tells how the owners of the papyrus plantations limited production to lift the price. Priests used the temple precincts as factories and turned out fine linens for their own use and for the market. Slaves outside of domestic service were few in Egypt, since free workers were paid only a notch above nudity and starvation. Sometimes the workers went on strike, anachoresis or secession. They left their tasks and took sanctuary on temple grounds, whence they were coaxed by hunger or fair words. Occasionally wages were raised, prices went up, and all was as before. Guilds were permitted, but they were mostly of tradesmen and managers. The government used them as agents for the collection of taxes and for the organization of forced labor on dikes, canals, and other public works. Internal trade was active but slow. Roads were poor and land transport moved on men, donkeys, or camels, which now replaced horses as draft animals in Africa. Much traffic went by inland waterways. A great canal, 150 feet wide, completed in Trajan's reign, bound the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean through the Nile and the Red Sea, from whose ports at Arsinoe, Myos Hormos, and Berenice ships left daily for Africa or India. The banking system that financed production and trade was under full governmental control. Each nome capital had a state bank, which acted as a receiver of taxes and repository of public funds. Loans were made to farmers, industry, and business by the government, by priests from temple treasuries, and by private lending associations. Taxes were laid upon every product, process, sale, export, or import, even upon graves and burials, and additional assessments were levied from time to time in kind from the poor, in liturgies from the rich. From Augustus to Trajan, the country, or its masters, prospered. After that zenith, it succumbed to the discouragement and exhaustion of endless tribute and taxation, and the lethargy of a regimented economy. Outside of Alexandria and Naucratis, Egypt remained sullenly, silently Egyptian. Romanization hardly touched it beyond the mouths of the Nile. And even Alexandria, which had been the greatest of Greek cities, was assuming in our 2nd century the character, languages, and odor of an oriental metropolis. Of Egypt's 8,500,000 population, its capital had now some 800,000. In 1930, it was 573,000. This second only to Rome. In industry and commerce, it was first. Everyone in Alexandria is busy, says a letter questionably Hadrian's. Everyone has a trade, even the lame and the blind find work to do. Here, among 1,000 other articles, glass, paper, and linen were produced on a large scale. Alexandria was the clothing and fashion center of the age, setting the styles and making the goods. Its great harbor had 9 miles of wharves, from which its merchant fleet wove a web of commerce over many seas. It was also a tourist center, equipped with hotels, guides, and interpreters for visitors coming to see the pyramids and the majestic temples of Thebes. The main avenue, 67 feet wide, was lined for 3 miles with colonnades, arcades, and alluring shops displaying the fanciest products of ancient crafts. At many intersections there were spacious squares or circles, named platii, or broad ways. whence the Italian piazza and our plaza and place. Imposing structures adorned the central thoroughfares, a large theater, an emporium or exchange, temples to Poseidon, Caesar, and Saturn, a celebrated Serapeum, or Temple of Serapis, and a group of university buildings known over the world as the Museum, or Home of the Muses. Of the 5 sections into which the city was divided, one was almost wholly given to the palaces, gardens, and administrative buildings of the Ptolemies, now used by the Roman prefect. Here, in a pretty mausoleum, lay the city's founder, Alexander the Great, preserved in honey and encased in glass. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Italians, Arabs, Phoenicians, Persians, Ethiopians, Syrians, Libyans, Cilicians, Scythians, Indians, Nubians, nearly every Mediterranean people had its quota in Alexandria. They made a volatile and inflammable mixture, quarrelsome and disorderly, intellectually clever and irreverently witty, shameless in speech, skeptical and superstitious, loose in morals and gay in mood, fanatically fond of the theater, music, and public games. Dio Chrysostom describes life there as a continuous revel of dancers, whistlers, and murderers. The canals were alive with merrymakers in gondolas at night on their 5-mile sail to the amusement suburb at Canopus. There were musical contests that rivaled the horse races in raising excitement and claques. If we may believe Philo, 40% of the city's population was Jewish. Most Alexandrian Jews were employed in industry and trade and lived in great poverty. Many were merchants, a few were moneylenders, some were rich enough to win enviable places in the government. Originally confined to 1/5 of the city, they had now overflowed to occupy 2/5. They were governed by their own laws and elders, and Rome confirmed the privileges that the Ptolemies had given them to ignore any ordinance that conflicted with their religion. They gloried in their magnificent central synagogue, a colonnaded basilica so vast that a system of signals had to be used to secure proper response at proper times from worshippers too distant from the sanctuary to hear the words of the priest. According to Josephus, the moral life of the Alexandrian Jews was exemplary compared with the sexual looseness of the pagan population. They had an active intellectual culture and contributed substantially to philosophy, historiography, and science. Racial hostility agitated the city at various times. We find in Josephus's tract Against Appian, an anti-Semitic leader, all the causes, arguments, and legends that disturb the relations of Jew and Gentile today. In A.D. 38, a mob of Greeks invaded the synagogues and insisted on placing in each of them a statue of Caligula as a god. The Roman prefect, Avilius Flaccus, annulled the Alexandrian citizenship of the Jews and ordered those of them who lived outside the original Jewish section to return to it within a few days. When these had elapsed, the Greek populace burned down 400 Jewish homes and killed or clubbed Jews outside the ghetto. And 38 members of the Jewish Gerousia, or Senate, were arrested and publicly scourged in a theater. Thousands of Jews lost their homes, their businesses, or their savings. Flaccus's successors submitted the matter to the emperor, and 2 separate delegations, 5 Greeks and 5 Jews, went to Rome in A.D. 40 to plead their causes before Caligula. He died before he could judge. Claudius restored the rights of the Jews in Alexandria, confirmed them in their municipal citizenship, and sternly bade both factions keep the peace. 2. Philo. The leader of the Jewish delegation to Caligula was the philosopher Philo, brother of the Arabarch, or manager of the Jewish export trade in Alexandria. Eusebius describes him as belonging to an ancient priestly family. We know hardly anything else of his life, but his pious and generous character stands out in the many works that he wrote to expound Judaism to the Greek world. Brought up in a sacerdotal atmosphere, intensely loyal to his people, and yet fascinated by Greek philosophy, he made it the aim of his life to reconcile the scriptures and customs of the Jews with Greek ideas, and above all with the philosophy of the most holy Plato. He adopted for his purpose the principle that all events, characters, doctrines, and laws in the Old Testament have an allegorical as well as a literal meaning and symbolize certain moral or psychological truths. By this method he was able to prove anything. He wrote indifferently in Hebrew, but so well in Greek that his admirers said, "Plato writes like Philo." He was a theologian rather than a philosopher, a mystic whose intense piety presaged Plotinus and the medieval mind. God in Philo is the essential being of the world, incorporeal, eternal, indescribable. Reason can know his existence, but can ascribe no quality to him, since every quality is a limitation. To conceive him as having human form is a concession to the sensuous imagination of men. God is everywhere. What place can a man find where God is not? But he is not everything. Matter is also eternal and increate. However, it has no life, motion, or form until infused with the divine force. To create the world by giving form to matter and to establish relations with man, God used a host of intermediary beings, called angels by the Jews, daimones by the Greeks, and ideas by Plato. These, says Philo, may popularly be conceived as persons, though really they exist only in the divine mind as the thoughts and powers of God. Together, these powers constitute what the Stoics called the logos, or divine reason, creating and guiding the world. Fluctuating between philosophy and theology, between ideas and personifications, Philo sometimes thinks of the logos as a person. In a poetic moment he calls the logos the first begotten of God, son of God by the virgin wisdom, and says that through the logos God has revealed himself to man. Since the soul is part of God, it can through reason rise to a mystic vision, not quite of God, but of the logos. Perhaps if we could free ourselves from the taint of matter and sense, and by ascetic exercises and long contemplation become for a moment pure spirit, we might for an ecstatic moment see God himself. Philo's logos was one of the most influential ideas in the history of thought. Its antecedents in Heraclitus, Plato, and the Stoics are obvious. Presumably he knew the recent Jewish literature that had made a distinct person of the wisdom of God as creator of the world. And he must have been impressed by those lines in Proverbs, chapter 8, verse 22, where wisdom says, "The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, or ever the earth was." Philo was a contemporary of Christ. He apparently never heard of him, but he shared unknowingly in forming Christian theology. The rabbis frowned upon his allegorical interpretations as likely to be used as an excuse for neglecting literal obedience to the law. They suspected the Logos doctrine as a retreat from monotheism, and they saw in Philo's passion for Greek philosophy a threat of cultural assimilation, racial dilution, and consequent disappearance of the dispersed Jews. But the fathers of the Church admired the Jews' contemplative devotion, made abundant use of his allegorical principles to answer the critics of the Hebrew Scriptures, and joined with Gnostics and Neoplatonists in accepting the mystical vision of God as the crown of human enterprise. Philo had tried to mediate between Hellenism and Judaism. From the Judaic point of view he had failed. From the historical point of view he had succeeded, and the result was the first chapter of the Gospel of John. 3. The progress of science. In science, Alexandria was the unchallenged head of the Hellenistic world. Claudius Ptolemy must be ranked among the most influential astronomers of antiquity, for despite Copernicus, the world is still Ptolemaic in its speech. Born at Ptolemais on the Nile, whence his name, he lived most of his life at Alexandria, where he made observations from AD 127 to 151. The world remembers him chiefly for his rejection of Aristarchus's theory that the earth revolves around the sun. This immortal error was enshrined in Ptolemy's Mathematicae Syntaxis, or mathematical arrangement of the stars. The Arabs referred to the work with the Greek superlative as Almagiste, the greatest, and the Middle Ages corrupted the phrase into Almagest, by which the book is known to history. It ruled the skies till Copernicus upset the world. And yet Ptolemy did not claim to do more than systematize the work and observation of previous astronomers, Hipparchus above all. He pictured the universe as spherical, and as daily revolving around a spherical, motionless earth. Strange as this view seems to us, though there's no telling what some future Copernicus will do to our present Ptolemies, the geocentric hypothesis made it possible to compute the position of the stars and planets more accurately than the heliocentric conception could do in the state of astronomic knowledge at the time. Ptolemy suggested further a theory of eccentrics to explain the orbits of the planets, and discovered the evection or orbital aberration of the moon. He measured the moon's distance from the Earth by the parallax method still in use and calculated it as 59 times the Earth's radius. This is approximately our current reckoning, but Ptolemy followed Posidonius in underestimating the diameter of the Earth. Just as the Syntaxis gathered ancient astronomy into its final form, so Ptolemy's geographical outline summarized antiquity's knowledge of the Earth's surface. Here, too, his industrious tables of latitude and longitude for the major cities of the globe were vitiated by accepting Posidonius's modest estimate of the Earth. But to this encouraging mistake, as transmitted by Ptolemy, Columbus owed his belief in the possibility of reaching the Indies in a practicable time by sailing west. Ptolemy was the first to use the terms parallels and meridians in geography, and in his maps he successfully projected a spherical upon a flat surface. But he was a mathematician rather than an astronomer or a geographer. His work consisted chiefly in mathematical formulations. In the syntaxis, he drew up an excellent table of chords. He divided the radius of the earth into 60 partes minutae primae, first small parts, which became our minutes, and subdivided each of these into 60 partes minutae secundae, second small parts, now our seconds. Though he made many mistakes, Ptolemy had the temper and patience of a true scientist. He tried to rest all conclusions upon observation, too seldom his own. In one field he carried out a long series of experiments. His Optica, a study of refraction, has been acclaimed as the most remarkable experimental research of antiquity. It is significant that this greatest astronomer, geographer, and mathematician of his age wrote also a tetrabiblios, or 4 books, on the control of human life by the stars. Meanwhile, a minor Archimedes was giving the classic world a second chance to stage an industrial revolution. A brilliant inventor or compiler, of whom we know only the one name, Hero, issued in this age at Alexandria a long succession of treatises on mathematics and physics, of which several have been preserved through Arabic translations. He warned his readers frankly that the theorems and inventions which he presented were not necessarily his own, but were the accumulations of centuries. In the Dioptra, he described an instrument like the theodolite, and formulated principles for measuring by surveying the distances to inaccessible points. In the Mechanica, he considered the uses and combinations of simple devices like the wheel, axle, lever, pulley, wedge, and screw. In the Pneumatica, he studied air pressure in 78 experiments, most of them playful tricks. For example, he showed how either wine or water could be made to flow from the same small orifice in the bottom of a jug by closing one or the other of the air holes at the top of the divided container. From these amusements he was led on to make a force pump, a fire engine pump with piston and valves, a hydraulic clock, a water organ, and a steam engine. In this contraption, the steam from heated water was passed into a globe by a tube and escaped through curved outlets at opposite sides, causing the globe to revolve in a direction contrary to that of the expelled steam. Hero's keen sense of humor kept him from developing this invention to industrial uses. He employed steam to support a ball in midair, to make a mechanical bird sing, to cause a statue to blow a horn. So in the Catoptrica, he studied the reflection of light and showed how to construct mirrors that would enable a person to see his back, or appear with head downward, or with 3 eyes, 2 noses, etc. He told magicians how to perform tricks by concealed apparatus. He made water pour from a font when a coin was inserted in the slot. He constructed a hidden machine by which heated water overflowed into a bucket, whose increased weight by pulleys opened temple doors. In these and 100 other ways, Hero succeeded in being a thaumaturgist and failed to become a Watt. Alexandria had long since been the chief center of medical education. There were famous schools of medicine at Marseille, Lyon, Saragossa, Athens, Antioch, Kos, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum. But medical students came to the Egyptian capital from every province. Even as late as the 4th century, when Egypt was in decline, Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that it is enough to commend a physician's skill if he can say that he was trained at Alexandria. Specialization was progressing. No one can be a universal physician, said Philostratus, circa AD 225. There must be specialists for wounds, fevers, eyes, consumption. Dissection of cadavers was practiced at Alexandria, and there seem to have been cases of human vivisection. Surgery was probably as well developed there in the 1st century AD as anywhere in Europe before the 19th century. Women physicians were not rare. One of them, Metrodora, wrote an extant treatise on diseases of the womb. Great names adorned the medical history of this age. Rufus of Ephesus, who described the anatomy of the eye, distinguished between motor and sensory nerves, and improved methods for stopping the flow of blood in surgery. Marinus of Alexandria, famous for his operations on the skull, and Antyllus, the greatest ophthalmologist of the time. Dioscorides of Cilicia, AD 40–90, wrote a Materia Medica, which scientifically described 600 medical plants so well that his book remained the chief authority on its subject until the Renaissance. He recommended medicated pessaries for contraception, and his recipe for wine of mandragora to produce surgical anesthesia was successfully applied in 1874. Cyranus of Ephesus, about AD 116, published a treatise on the diseases of women and the birth and care of children. It ranks only below the Hippocratic collection and the works of Galen among the extant products of ancient medicine. He describes a vaginal speculum and an obstetric chair, gives an excellent anatomy of the uterus, offers almost modern dietetic and operative advice, such as bathing the eyes of the newborn child with oil, suggests 100 contraceptive devices, mostly by vaginal medication, and, unlike Hippocrates, allows abortion where delivery would endanger the mother's life. Cyranus was the greatest gynecologist of antiquity. No advance was made on his work till Paré, 15 centuries after him. If all his 40 treatises were extant, we should probably rank him with Galen. The most famous physician of the period was the son of a Pergamese architect, who named him Galenus, that is, quiet and peaceable, in the hope that he would not take after his mother. At 14, the youth found his first love in philosophy, from whose dangerous lure he was never freed. At 17, he turned to medicine, studied in Cilicia, Phoenicia, Palestine, Cyprus, Crete, Greece, and Alexandria, a mobility typical of ancient scholars, served as a surgeon in the gladiatorial school at Pergamum, and practiced for a time in Rome, from AD 164 to 168. There his successful cures brought him many rich patients, and his lectures drew distinguished audiences. His repute rose to such a point that people wrote to him from every province for medical advice, and he confidently prescribed by mail. His good father, forgetting the purpose of his name, had counseled him to join no sect or party and always to tell the truth. Galen obeyed, exposed the ignorance and venality of many physicians in Rome, and in a few years had to flee from his enemies. Marcus Aurelius called him back to care for young Commodus in 169 and tried to take him on a Marcomannic campaign. But Galen was clever enough to be soon back in Rome. Thereafter we know nothing of him except his works. He was almost as voluminous as Aristotle. Of 500 volumes ascribed to him, some 118 have survived, covering in 20,000 pages all branches of medicine and several fields of philosophy. They are of little medical value today, but they abound in incidental information and in the vitality of a vigorous and controversial spirit. His fondness for philosophy had given him a bad habit of drawing large deductions from small inductions. His faith in his own knowledge and powers often betrayed him into a dogmatism impossible to a scientific mind, and his great authority prolonged for centuries the life of serious errors. Nevertheless, he was an accurate observer and the most experimental of ancient physicians. I confess the disease from which I have suffered all my life, to trust no statements until, so far as possible, I have tested them for myself. Forbidden by the Roman government to dissect the human body alive or dead, he dissected and vivisected animals, and sometimes too readily concluded to human anatomy from a study of apes, dogs, cows, and pigs. Despite his limitations, Galen made more contributions to anatomy than any other observer in antiquity. He described accurately the bones of the cranium and the spinal column, the muscular system, the lacteal vessels, the ducts of the lingual and submaxillary glands, and the valves of the heart. He showed that an excised heart can continue to beat outside the body. He proved that the arteries contain blood, not air, as the Alexandrian school had taught for 400 years. He missed anticipating Harvey. He thought that most of the blood traveled forth as well as back in the veins, while the remainder, mixed with air from the lungs, moved to and fro in the arteries. He was the first to explain the mechanism of respiration, and brilliantly conjectured that the principal element in the air we breathe is also that which is active in combustion. He differentiated pleurisy and pneumonia, described aneurysm, cancer, and tuberculosis, and recognized the infectious nature of the last. Above all, he founded experimental neurology. He made the first experimental sections of the spinal cord, determined the sensory and motor functions of each segment, understood the sympathetic system, recognized 7 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and caused aphasia at will by cutting the laryngeal nerve. He showed that injuries to one side of the brain produced derangements in the opposite side of the body. He cured the sophist Pausanias of numbness in the 4th and 5th fingers of the left hand by stimulating the brachial plexus in which the ulnar nerve arises that controls those fingers. He was so skilled in symptomatology that he preferred to diagnose without questioning the patient. He made much use of diet, exercise, and massage, but was also an expert on drugs and traveled widely to secure rare medicines. He condemned the prescription of offal and urine, still popular with some of his contemporaries, recommended dried cicadas for colic, applied goat dung to a tumor, and gave a long list of illnesses that could be cured by theriac, a famous drug made as an antidote for Mithridates the Great, daily imbibed by Marcus Aurelius, and containing the flesh of snakes. He tarnished his record as an experimentalist by a torrent of precipitate theory. He ridiculed magic and spells, accepted divination by dreams, and thought that the phases of the moon affected the condition of patients. He took up Hippocrates' notion of the four humors, blood and phlegm, black and yellow bile, added a dash of Pythagoras' doctrine of four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and tried to reduce all diseases to derangement of these humors or these elements. He was a firm vitalist, convinced that a pneuma, or vital breath or spirit, pervaded and activated every part of the body. Mechanistic interpretations of biology had been advanced by several physicians, as for example by Asclepiades, who held that physiology should be treated as a branch of physics. Galen objected that whereas a machine is merely the sum of its parts, an organism implies the purposive control of the parts by the whole. And just as purpose alone can explain the origin, structure, and function of organs, so the universe, Galen thought, can be understood only as the expression and instrument of some divine plan. God, however, operates solely through natural laws. There are no miracles, and the best revelation is nature herself. Galen's teleology and monotheism won him favor with Christians, as later with Muslims. Nearly all his writings were lost to Europe in the chaos of the barbarian invasions, but in the East they were preserved by Arab scholars, and were translated from Arabic into Latin from the 11th century onward. Galen became then an uncriticized authority, an Aristotle for medieval medicine. The last creative age of Greek science ended with Ptolemy and Galen. Experiment ceased, dogma ruled. Mathematics relapsed into restatements of geometry, biology into Aristotle, natural science into Pliny, and medicine marked time until the Arab and Jewish physicians of the Middle Ages renewed the noblest of the sciences. 4. Poets in the Desert. Across the Red Sea from Egypt lay Arabia. Neither the Pharaohs, nor the Achaemenids, nor the Seleucids, nor the Ptolemies, nor the Romans had been able to conquer the mysterious peninsula. Arabia Deserta knew only Arab nomads, but in the southwest a mountain range and its streams gave milder temperatures and fruitful vegetation to Arabia Felix, the Yemen of today. In those recesses the little kingdom of Saba hid, the Sheba of the Bible, so rich in frankincense and myrrh, cassia and cinnamon, aloes and nard, senna and gum and precious stones, that the Sabbateans could build at Marieba and elsewhere cities proud with temples, palaces, and colonnades. Arab merchants not only sold Arab products at high prices, but carried on a caravan trade with northwestern Asia and an active commerce by sea with Egypt, Parthia, and India. In 25 BC, Augustus sent Aelius Gallus to absorb the kingdom into the empire. The legions failed to take Marieba and returned to Egypt decimated by disease and heat. Augustus contented himself with destroying the Arab port at Adana, now Aden, and thereby securing control of the trade between Egypt and India. The main commercial route running north from Marieba went through the northwest corner of the peninsula, known to the ancients as Arabia Petrea, from its capital at Petra, some 40 miles south of Jerusalem. The city had been named from the circle of steep crags within which it was strategically placed. There, in the 2nd century BC, the Nabatean Arabs established a kingdom that slowly grew rich on passing caravans, until its rule extended from Lus Komi on the Red Sea along the eastern border of Palestine, through Gerasa and Bostra to Damascus. Under King Aretas IV, from 9 BC to AD 40, the country reached its zenith. Petra became a Hellenistic city, Aramaic in speech, Greek in art, Alexandrian in the splendor of its streets. To this time belong the finest of the giant tombs that were carved into the rocks outside the city, crude but powerful facades of double-tiered Greek colonnades, sometimes 100 feet in height. After Trajan annexed Arabia Petrea into the empire in 106, Bostra became the capital of the province of Arabia and raised in its turn the architectural symbols of wealth and power. Petra decayed as Bostra and Palmyra became the crossroads of the desert caravans, and the great tombs lapsed into the night stalls of nomad flocks. The most striking feature of the great empire was its numerous and populous cities. Never again till our own century has urbanization been so pronounced. Lucullus, Pompey, Caesar, Herod, Hellenistic kings, and Roman emperors prided themselves on founding new cities and embellishing old ones. So, moving northward along the eastern Mediterranean coast, one could hardly go 20 miles without encountering a city. Raphia, Gaza, Ascalon, Joppa, Apollonia, Samaria Sebast, and Caesarea. These cities, though in Palestine, were half Greek in population and predominantly Greek in language, culture, and institutions. They were Hellenistic bridgeheads in the pagan invasion of Judea. Herod spent large sums making Caesarea worthy of Augustus, for whom it was named. He provided it with a fine harbor, a lofty temple, a theater, an amphitheater, sumptuous palaces, and many edifices of white stone. Farther inland were other Greek Palestinian cities, Livius, Philadelphia, Gerasa, and Gadara. At Gerasa stand 100 columns of the colonnade that lined the main street, and the ruins of temples, theater, baths, and aqueduct proclaim the affluence of the town in the 2nd century A.D. Gadara, where the remains of 2 theaters echo with memories of Greek plays, was famous for its schools, professors, and authors. Here, in the 3rd century B.C., had lived Menippus, the cynic philosopher and humorist whose satires taught that everything is vain except an upright life, and gave a model to Lucilius, Varro, and Horace. Here in his Syrian Athens, some 100 years before Christ, Meleager, the Anacreon of the age, polished epigrams to fair ladies and handsome boys, and wore out his pen with love. Brightly the goblet smiles, since rested here Xenophala's sweet mouth, to love so dear. How blessed would she to mine her rose lips place, and drink my soul out in a long embrace. One of these flames, too soon snuffed out, burned with especial brightness in his memory, Heliodora, whom he loved entire. I'll twine white violets and the myrtle green, Narcissus will I twine and lilies sheen. I'll twine sweet crocus and the hyacinth blue, and last I'll twine the rose, love's token true, that all may form a wreath of beauty, meet to deck my Heliodora's tresses sweet. Now Hades has snatched her, and the dust has tarnished her flower in bloom. O Mother Earth, I pray thee, clasp her gently to thy breast. Meleager immortalized himself by gathering into a garland, or Stephanos, the elegiac verse of Greece from Sappho to Meleager. Out of this and like collections grew by merger the Greek anthology. Here is the Greek epigram at its best and worst, polished like a jewel or empty as a pose. It was unwise to pluck these 4,000 flowers from their branches to make this fading wreath. Some of the verses commemorate forgotten great men, or famous statues or dead relatives. Some, so to speak, are autotaphs, as when a woman who died of triplets says pithily, "After this, let women pray for children." Some are barbs aimed at physicians, shrews, undertakers, pedagogues, cuckolds, or the miser who, fainting, is revived by the smell of a penny, or the grammarian whose grandchild displayed successively all 3 genders, or the pugilist who retires, marries, and gets more blows than he ever received in the ring, or the dwarf who, carried off by a mosquito, thinks he is suffering the rape of Ganymede. A single epigram celebrates that famous woman who slept with only one man. Others dedicate offerings to the gods. Laius hangs up her mirror as useless now that it does not show her as she was. Nicias, after 50 years of serving men, surrenders her complacent girdle to Venus. Some stanzas glorify the arterial dilation of wine as wiser than wisdom. One honors the unceasing monogamy of the adulterer who was buried by a wreck in the arms of his mistress. Some are pagan dirges on the brevity of life. Some are Christian assurances of a happy resurrection. Most of them, of course, toast the beauty of women and boys and sing the painful ecstasy of love. Everything that later literature has said about amorous itching is here said in brief and in full, with more than Elizabethan conceits. Meleager makes a mosquito his pander by charging it with a message to his lady of the hour, and his townsman Philodemus, philosophic mentor of Cicero, tunes a melancholy note to his Xantho. White waxen cheeks, soft-scented breast, deep eyes wherein the muses nest, sweet lips that perfect pleasure bring, sing me your song, pale Xantho, sing. Too soon the music ends. Again, again repeat the sad sweet strain. With perfumed fingers touch the string. O love's delight, pale Xantho, sing. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.